Welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. I'm delighted that you spend time with us today. I know there's lots of going on and you have many such invitations. We have a great conversation planned for you and you're going to take part in it. There'll be ample time for comment and Q&A. Let me ask you this as a favor before we begin. I know we're all kind of zoomed out, but for a moment, if you would, if you're in a position to do so, could you just switch your camera on so we can see everybody just for a few seconds before we start? And then, gosh, look, great, wonderful to see you one day in person, maybe even this summer or fall, but thank you for that. And then if you're inclined, you're certainly invited and welcome to switch your camera off and multitask and do whatever it is that you need to do. So thank you for that. So I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. As a framing thought, who would have thought, 5 or 6 years ago, if I had said to you, we're going to be in a global pandemic, a real estate operative will be president of the United States, a journalist of Britain, a comedian will lead Ukraine, and we'll have these endlessly fraught and divisive debates over nationalism, you would have kicked me out of the room. And here we are. And it's a moving target, and it's intense. And some of these subjects have become and are terribly important. I think we have two fabulous conversation partners on this topic today. Peter Skerry, I'll introduce, and then he does the honors of introducing our guest of honor. But you, Peter, are a friend. You're a contributing editor for American Purpose. You're a professor of political science and a writer and author at Boston College. And Peter, it's your show to introduce Yael Tamir, to manage the first part of the conversation, you and Uli, and then for the latter half, you will open it up to questions. We have a hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. That's 8 p.m. in Israel, so that Yael can, God forbid, go back to work or at least have a bite to eat for dinner. Peter, welcome to you, and Yael, great to see you. Peter?
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And of course, thanks for Yael Tamir for being here and being willing to talk to us about her recent and very fine book, Why Nationalism? Let me just say a few things. That Yael Tamir is not only a scholar, intellectual, she's also a political actor, and I think what's fair to say has been a political activist. Maybe she still considers herself a political activist. She was one of the founders of the Peace Now in 1978, and then was an activist with the Rotz Party in the early 80s. And subsequently, she was a member of the Knesset for the Labor Party between 2003 and 2010, and was a minister of immigrant absorption and education during part of that time. From 2010 to 2020, she was president of Shankar College of Engineering and Design. She's also been an adjunct professor at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. And as of October 2020, she is president of Beit Barel College in Israel. It gives you a sense of the many things that Yael Tamir has done and how she approaches these topics. Her previous book, earlier book, Liberal Nationalism, to my mind, is also a fine piece of work. It's more theoretical, and I discern in it from the 1990s preoccupations, concerns with the outbreak of nationalism in the European continent, especially threatening to break up larger nation states. And she reconciles her liberalism with nationalism in that book in a very interesting and enlightening way. Her book that we're here to talk about today, Why Nationalism in 2019, to my mind is much more of this moment. And I doubt that she would disagree with that. It's a defense of nationalism as a proposition. Uh, she she certainly rejects the view that nationalism is some kind of retrograde historical move backwards, but rather an aspect of modernization. And she, at the same time, disagrees with notions of civic nationalism, because she regards nationalism, I think it's fair to say, as a cultural as well as an ideological formation. Um, um, and apropos of that, just a couple of quotes from her book to kind of prime the audience a bit. Some of the insightful things she has to say. She mentions how sharing resources and social responsibilities is logical for those who anticipate spending a lifetime together. It is far less so for those who expect to move from one entity to another. Um, and she also posits what she calls a cultural version of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And here I'm quoting, "One cannot create communities that are both meaningful and entirely open. The more meaningful a community is to its members, the more exclusive it would be to all others." Now, therein lies some wisdom that we in American politics could really learn from today, as our southern border is coming to our attention again, and the claims of dispossessed people south of the border are challenge us once again as to how much we can open ourselves to them. Um, so I would finish in my effort to kind of tantalize you with Yulie Tamir's articulation of this liberal nationalism that seeks to address the concerns of so many ordinary people around the world today, including obviously millions of Americans whose anger and concerns and anxieties have, I think it's fair to say, bubbled over. And on just one final note, one of the most striking insights that I find in this book is not so theoretical, not so on the intellectual plane, but it must come, I would assume, from her experience as having been the Minister of Immigrant Integration. She talks about in the book how immigrants in contemporary societies disrupt neighborhoods and cause challenges to local communities in disrupting neighborhoods. That's her term. As somebody who's spent a lot of time studying, trying to write about immigration impacts, I find that an insightful and refreshing, if not obvious, insight into what many Americans are the origins of their anxieties about immigration. We tend to get caught up in more abstruse issues, but the simple fact of how immigrants do impinge upon people's daily lives and challenge people who don't feel well prepared to address those challenges. I applaud Yael Tamir for that kind of very insightful on the ground perspective, as well as her broader intellectual achievement. So with that, I fear I've already spoken too long. Let me turn it over to Yael, and I guess I would ask Yael off the top of my head, how, if she sees her book that came out in 2019, Why Nationalism, in 2021, do you see things very much the same way? Certainly in light of events that have been going on in America since then, to which I know you devote some attention and you know America well. Does anything cause you to reassess your evaluation of nationalism in the current context? Yuli.
Good evening. It's evening for me, sorry. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to speak to this audience. I would say that what happened in the last few months didn't really change my mind about the way I present the difficulties and the challenges nationalism raises for the liberal progressive camp. I should start by saying that I'm a liberal. I've been part of liberalism in Israel is defined a little bit different than in the United States, but I'm a human rights activist. I've been in labor all my life, and part of this book um, is an attempt to explain to myself how do I settle the two things I believe in? I'm a Zionist and I'm a human rights activist and I'm a peace activist. And it took me a while. My first book actually came out of my own dilemma, trying to explain to people who I am and do I have a consistent view about my own life. And that's something a lot of people ask me, both in Israel and at Oxford where I wrote my dissertation. And everybody thought nationalism was, something that has been dead and gone, and no one should deal with it anymore. Luckily, I met a Zaya Berlin who was old enough to remember that nationalism is a great and important issue, and he supported me in my work. I still think nationalism is a very important issue, and I think that the fact that we and I don't know the audience, but I and my people, like-minded people, ignored nationalism has made us much less powerful. We have lost some of the powers of governance and the powers of argument and surrendered them to the extreme right. Um, for me, nationalism is not necessarily extreme. It could turn extreme, but honestly, most political theories could turn extreme. One of the big warnings of Azar Berlin about every theory taking to its logical conclusion can be absurd and dangerous. And I think we've seen it sometimes with liberalism, sometimes with other ideas. Nationalism is certainly prone to become dangerous, but it also has an amazing power of recruitment. I don't think we would have the welfare state without nationalism. I think that's what we see now during the Corona time, when people are trying to make states engaged in protecting citizens. A lot of the welfare state kind of dialogue is being reintroduced. It's important for us to be able to work together to create something we believe in. So for me, nationalism has the power of recruitment, it has the power of conviction, and it gives people, which I think is extremely important. I think this is why Peter said it's more cultural than civic. I think it gives us a cultural context within which we live and gives our life a meaning. It's very hard to create a meaning on your own. Actually, it's impossible for all of you who read Charles Taylor's amazing articles in Human Agency. It's the meaningfulness that we're looking for when we are talking with other people about our history, our culture, our language, our literature, whatever. And this is something that is specifically human and specifically valuable, and you can't really replace it with any other cohesive power. So nationalism is still important, and I think the real question is what kind of nationalism we want to endorse. And in many ways, I would say, and that I'm following America, but from afar, I would say that a lot of what Biden did in the last few months of his campaign, and maybe now as a president, or is extremely, and actually in a very, I think, attractive way, quiet about what he's doing. He's after Trump's noisy period, it's quiet now. But I think the question of what is America about? What we owe America, what we owe American workers, what we owe the society, is coming back, I think, in a very massive way, both in the United States and in other countries. And once it is phrased in a way that is, I think, more balanced with other values, it becomes an important and significant point of view. And I would suggest that though Biden didn't have yet to, or didn't make the choice on the border with Mexico, he will not take Angela Merkel's view about open border. He will make a statement about who can come in and who cannot. He will say something about defending the American border. And as much as I think we learned from the European case, those countries who were open to open their borders had to withdraw with some very horrible consequences, both for the locals, but also for the immigrants. And that's maybe the part Peter referred to. A lot of the unexpected consequences of opening borders in a generous way, like in Germany or in Sweden, actually resulted in quite horrific results for both the immigrant communities and the veterans. So for me, life is about balancing ideas, and I'm trying to balance these two ideas I'm very much attached to, both liberalism and nationalism. And I think this middle road that is created from this balancing act is actually the right way forward, and also gives the progressive forces a sense of collective identity they could be using to recruit others to support them. Coming the next election, well, Israel is a disaster because it has gone astray, but I think in many countries, people who would like to see more progressive forces come on board will need to use some of the national language in order to convince them that this is the right solution for them.
Okay, thanks, Yuli. You certainly put a lot on the table there, and I'm very tempted to pick up on some of those themes with regard to immigration, a field that I know well and that I suspect many others have views on. But let me press you on a different aspect of your argument, if I could, that I find very intriguing. Your criticism of civic nationalism has great appeal to me and makes a lot of sense. But I'm struck that many of my friends and colleagues in the United States are very drawn to civic nationalism. I don't think it's unfair to say that many of my friends and colleagues who are Jewish intellectuals in particular are drawn to civic nationalism. Because of course, if we talk about American culture, we don't have to go very far before we start dealing with America's Christian orientation, the role that Christianity's played in America. And that's obviously for Jews, now for Muslims, for lots of other groups in America, a hard aspect of America to embrace as part of its national identity, or at least it's problematic. And so that's the appeal in my mind of civic nationalism, and I can understand that. I just wonder how you think about that as an Israeli and somebody who knows America well.
Well, I think that it's not a question of being Israeli. I think civic nationalism is too thin to create an identity. I think, by the way, we see it all over Europe. Countries that were entirely civic, when they now confront the Muslim community, because they never had a conversation about real identities, only constitutional identities, are actually going to a very extreme. I mean, if you see now the legislation in Switzerland, in France, in the Netherlands, in Denmark against Muslims, you'll see that these, for me, this is the consequence of really not understanding the distinction between culture, religion, and civic identity. And suddenly it sounds like that if you are a believer, a Muslim believer, you can't be a citizen. So I think this really makes it very clear that behind the civic nationalism, there was always a culture. The thing I don't like about civic nationalism, that it's a camouflage. So if now the Swiss say, revealing your face is part of our civic identity, and I'm saying, no, 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 it's part of your religious culture, because if you were a Jew, you would cover your head. If you were a Muslim, you would maybe cover more than that. So it's, or handshaking, this debate about handshaking. Suddenly handshaking is part of our civic identity. No, this is part of your cultural identity. And unless you place the debate at the right place, you are actually deaf to the real concerns of cultural concerns of other communities. So my only problem with civic nationalism, that it's not genuine. I'll tell you a nice story, which I always remember. I was once in Germany on a debate like this, and the Germans, constitutional, identity was their identity. And there was a big debate about identity. There was a very nice scholar whose origin was from Turkey. Unfortunately, I don't remember his name. And everybody spoke about the German identity as being totally constitutional. And suddenly he raised his hand and he said, well, I live here in Germany for many years. I'm fluent in German. I can't feel German. And they said, why? I mean, the Constitution, it's here for you. And he said, no, 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 because part of your identity is feeling guilty about the Holocaust. And I can't share this guilt because I don't know what to do with it. And suddenly the whole room had nothing to say, because it is true that a lot of the national identity of Germany turns around this, maybe not so much now as it was then, but it was not included in any constitutional item. And this poor guy tried to place himself within this identity and found there is a whole area where he is really not part of it. Yeah. So I just want us to be more honest with ourselves about who we are and what keeps us together. I think it helps us to understand real life problems.
Well, I appreciate your response. I guess I'm still left wondering if one is in a country as large as the United States and where its Christian heritage is so strong and so powerful a means of mobilizing so many Americans, whether for good or ill. How do you reconcile a member of a religious minority to embracing American values and identity if to them it looks like that is a kind of Christian identity that is going to obliterate their own heritage? I mean, I think that's how it comes across to many Muslims I know. I don't think it's the same for American Jews, but I think it's there's an edge to it that is objectionable, and it's not so much protection of minority religious concerns, although that's a concern of mine. It's more how you reconcile the minorities to the majority, which I think is a big preoccupation in your book, really.
Well, being a minority, you always have some sense, sort of there is a place where the identity is not complete. The overlap between you and your identity is not complete. By the way, it could happen to people. I'm an Israeli, violation of human rights in Israel, and my commitment to human rights makes me, my Israeli identity sort of shaken. So it's not only minorities or maybe human rights supporters are a minority now in Israel, but yeah, I mean, we should acknowledge, but by the way, this is also, again, in a human way, for me to understand that even if there will be full equality to the Arabs in Israel, 100%, everything letter by letter, they will still be a minority, and that's a position that I should take into account. So it actually, I think, civic identity somehow overshadows the difficulties of minorities and makes it seems like it's all okay, and now we can go ahead and we don't need to pay attention to the grievances. And I want us to pay attention to people's grievances, even if legally they are all equal. And that's sort of the deeper level that, I mean, we should take into account when talking about identity.
Okay. I can't help but let me press this a little bit. We're going to be taking questions in a second, but in America today, now I don't think this is unfair to ask you this. You're not here, but I know you keep track of things. What's going on here? It seems to me, teaching as I do on a university campus, young minority students, and I don't think it's just because they're young. I think it's because of the tenor of minority politics, political aspirations among racial, ethnic, and other kinds of minorities today in America, that they're not. It's not a two-way street. That their preoccupations are very self-preoccupied, and their demands are rather oblivious to the cultural realities of the majorities, and that's pretty hard to overcome, and it's pretty hard to challenge. But it's also part of the mix today, certainly in America, and I don't think it's so different in other countries. Do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, I think majorities are strong enough to be attentive to the demands of the minorities, even when they are painful or difficult. I think this is where, every time I was part of track 2 with the negotiations with the Palestinians, and Israelis would say, without thinking, well, you should be, aware of our history, and we should be aware of our fears, and I take them into account. And always the Palestinian would say, and what about us? You should be aware of our history. You should be aware of our fears. And being the strongest partner, it is your duty to accommodate. Sometimes it's not comfortable. Sometimes it's really threatening, and sometimes it touches upon very, very difficult issues like the status of women in a community and things like that are real. Sometimes they're real questions that are really hard to settle. So I'm running a school that is very diverse. I have Jews and Arabs and Christians and seculars and ultra-Orthodox. And I have to settle all these questions. This is my life, right? Okay. These ultra-Orthodox don't want to study with women. These Muslim women feel uncomfortable with a male instructor. These people feel uncomfortable that they are not wanted. That's my life. I do balancing every morning. But I think that's what human beings are like. They have sensitivities, and being empowered meant that you would be more sensitive than those who are in the minority. So that's a little privilege of being in a minority.
Yeah, I guess my point would be that for many Americans today, I think the Americans that you must have had in mind when you wrote your book, as well as other similarly situated people in other Western democracies, but certainly in America, many non-minority Americans, many white Americans, don't feel like they're that they're in the advantaged situation. They don't feel like they're powerful. And I think young minority spokesmen and lots of minority spokesmen, they know in some way, I'm sure they would disagree with me violently, but they know that they have powerful elite forces behind them in American society. That doesn't mean they're going to win, but they know that there's a certain correlation of forces that's, it seems to me, in their direction. And for so many of the white Americans who are left behind by the global forces that you write about, they don't feel that, and they don't get much sympathy from the minorities who are getting lots of attention. And I think that's why we wind up with the kind of politics we've had and the kind of president we had for 4 years. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but that's what I'm.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that there are minority. I think we miss in our majority distinction other minorities like class,
Yeah.
Other identification, I would say, like class, like urban versus rural. So there are many ways of identifying yourself and many ways of feeling excluded. And that's, I think, part of what, unfortunately, Trump understood intuitively and many liberals didn't.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I should turn to a couple of questions now. Does that seem like the right time, Jeff?
Peter, it does. Good. Open up the floor.
Okay. There's a question here from Michael Perschi. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the name. And he asks, would it be wise for advocates of nationalism in the US, whether civic or not, to avoid overt praise of diversity? Does progressives' praise of difference create an incentive for prejudice and an incentive for conscious overt white pride? It's a bit in the vein of what I was asking, Yuli. Would you have a response to that?
Yeah, I actually don't think we should advocate less diversity, but we should understand that unless we find within ourselves something that is that connects us, that makes us work together, then we're not going to have a political system that is functional. And societies are built very differently. America is much more diverse to begin with. I mean, diversity is part of maybe the ethos of the American identity, which is not, for example, with France, right? France is a very cultural and linguistic identity. England has a very sort of historical monarchic identity. So you have to balance your historical identity with the diversity that comes in. And within that balance, know that we're all changing. The majority is changing, the minority is changing. But knowing that this change is happening, we should be aware of the cost of change. And the cost of change is something that cannot be ignored and should be actually handled by the state. To go back to the question you've asked about minority neighborhoods. It's not about stopping immigration, but allowing the free market to handle the immigration is a disaster, because then they all go to Malmo, and Malmo becomes a place where nobody can live, neither the immigrants nor the Swede. So if you're ready to bring people in, and I think you shouldn't close yourself up entirely. You should bring them in and accommodate them. And Israel in this case is very unique because it has, being a minister of immigration, actually you deal with integrating the people, and sometimes you fail, sometimes you succeed, but you're aware at least to just allowing people in and then letting it happen. This is a great example where free hand and free market do not solve the issue. And the sad consequences of the free hand with immigration is that the immigrants settle in the most poor neighborhood, cheap and it's possible. And then the people who pay the price are the people who are already paying the price of social inequality. So it's not against immigration, it's about managing immigration. And it's not against diversity, it's about managing diversity. It's a very big difference.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I'm tempted to press you a little bit. The point you make in your book about immigrants causing disruption in neighborhoods, that's a broad description of the problem. But I'm curious, what kinds of policies, when you were minister, can you bring to bear to address those kinds of disruptions, and what kinds of disruptions maybe were you trying to deal with? Because obviously my question is motivated by the fact that it's much easier to say that the government should deal with these things than doing it. Obviously it's very difficult, but you know that.
Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you a story of failure.
Okay.
But when the Ethiopians, the Ethiopian community came to Israel, it was quite clear that there is a huge cultural gap between the Ethiopian community and the rest of Israel, and that they need a period of being sort of adjust and incorporate in the community. By the way, I should say that now 3 generations later, it has actually worked rather well. Not perfect, but well. And what I try to do is to, the ministry would have given them loans to buy houses, state-funded loans to buy houses. I wanted to not allow more than 30% within one neighborhood.
Okay.
So there will be a spread because, strangely enough, I'm sorry, but human rights activists could also be idiots sometimes. Some human rights activists said that was discrimination. The court ruled against me. And as a result, we have now 6 or 7 huge Ethiopian neighborhoods that went out of control. But my idea then was that you force a mixture. You don't allow just communities to become totally Black, because they're not going to function and it's going to be a nightmare. And that's what happened. In many other cases, it did work. So immigrants were settling around greater sort of spread of communities. And there was a lot of investment in allowing them to go, especially to higher education. Because the assumption was that the generation that immigrated is not going to do that well, but if we want their children to succeed, they need to go to higher education. And that with the Russian, it worked incredibly well. With many other immigrants, it worked very well. And even now with the Ethiopian, with more and more lawyers and doctors and people from the Ethiopian community, the gap was, the cultural gap was larger, but there was a well-intended intention. They should speak Hebrew. They should be accepted in schools wherever they wanted. They should get support in school. They should get an open door to higher education to make it go away within a generation or 2. And
Okay.
basically it worked.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
But if you go to the neighborhoods in France or in around Paris or in Malmo, there are children that they're not going to school. Even 3rd generation of poverty of children who are not functioning in schools, even in basic studies.
Yeah. Okay. Let me turn now to a question from Gabe Schoenfeld, who's one of our contributing editors. He asks, in his new book, Stephen Smith sharply distinguishes nationalism from patriotism, arguing in a nutshell that the former depends on a dark Schmittian friend-enemy dualism, while patriotism in building community calls upon our better angels. How do you view the distinction between nationalism and patriotism?
Well, I think this is a distinction sort of without a difference. It's very cultural. In America, I mean, people think patriotism is civic. In Europe, by the way, patriotism is more cultural and religious. It's the being attached to your own nation or patria or to your community of identity has many different ways of expressing itself. Patriotism is one, nationalism, communitarianism. I mean, there are other ways. I think nationalism and patriotism in the 19th centuries, there was no difference. National self-determination was an act of patriotism and an act of nationalism. But a lot of people who want to say, oh, there's a good nationalism and a bad nationalism. So the good nationalism is patriotism and the bad nationalism is xenophobia. That's okay. I believe there is a good and bad nationalism. I would just rather, look it in the eye and say that's nationalism. We should be committed to our nation and to our home and to our country. And we shouldn't overdo it. So we shouldn't be zealots and we shouldn't be too, disconnected, and there are patriots who do terrible things for the country, and there are nationalists who just balance it out rightly. So it's a semantical debate. I'm not too, I don't see that once we move from nationalism to patriotism, the world has changed and everything is now perfect.
Yes.
I don't think it's true.
Okay, thank you. We don't have any other questions right now. I'm wondering if, Jeff, do you have a question you would like to pose to Yuli or Michelle?
I would be happy to, and thank you, Yuli and Peter, for this conversation. I had my camera off because I was trying, but I wasn't very, Gabe, I wasn't fast and elegant. I wanted to put into chat your review for Us American Purpose on February 17th of the Smith book. So if someone from my team would put that in, or if you all would be aware of that, it was a fine review of an interesting book. Peter, I would like to go back to Yuli's comments about Germany. Every place is a special case, and Germany is certainly a special case. And Yuli, you alluded to the collocation that I think comes originally from Habermas, constitutional patriotism. And you've told us why, or if you wish, civic patriotism, why this is generally thin and you are compelling. And talk about a case like Germany, because Germany feels, and for obvious reasons, oh so conflicted 70 years later about anything that is nationalism or even patriotism. It's still a bit of an article of fate that this modern Germany is post-national and is embedding its identity in a wider European context. A unique case, but could you speak to that a little bit, please?
I don't think actually Germany is post-nationalist. I think that, it's very interesting to look at even the relationship between West and East Germany. So at the top, Angela Merkel is from the East and, everything is okay. But when you talk with people in East Germany, they suddenly have a distinction and a clear identity of Easterners and Westerners. So the years of separation left their mark. And I think Germany in many ways, it's a suppressed identity. For example, when you speak, I'm now a head of a teachers college. I talk and work a lot about education. When you ask Germans why do they do, they do streaming of children very early to vocational training, and whether they think it's fair. And so the first thing they say to do, well, that's the German way of doing things. And it worked for us. This is why Germany is the biggest economy. When you in Europe, obviously, when you look at the dialogue between Germany and Greece in the Eurobonds after the pandemic, you hear a lot of why we Germans need to carry the burden of Greece. I mean, it's not that there is no identity of we Germans. It has been, for good reason, silent after the Holocaust. But at the end of the day, I think there is a German way of doing things. It's very strong. It's in education, it's in culture, it's in research, it's in every way where culture penetrates our life, right? It's not a one thing that covers all. Within the debate about Europe, well, the Germans say we are European, but everybody again around them says that's Germany recontrolling Europe. So the matters of identity are not as simple as they seem. Just the fact that you say we are only constitutionally connected, I think is actually too narrow, and it tries to suppress something where I understand why they try to suppress it, but still, I don't think it's a true reflection of the real identity of people. I think if you scratch a little bit the surface, becomes the real, and I don't think it's bad. I just think it's the way things are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I've got a question now from Kevin Curran, who's sitting in Prague, a city that Jeff knows well. And he's obviously concerned about Hungarian minorities in that part of the world. And his question is about dual citizenship. Is dual citizenship itself, especially perhaps in the instance of that part of Europe, a hindrance to fostering nationalism? Is it possible to foster nationalism with these constructs in place, or does it necessarily splinter minorities?
That's a very interesting question. Israelis always ask themselves whether American Jews are more American or more Jews. And I think this is a question about a lot of minorities are asked over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Because being a citizen is a status that demands obligation and commitment and so on, and being a part of a nation. Dual identities or conflicting identities is something we all have, and dual citizenship, I think, is bearable to an extent. It's something that people, can live with personally, and also states can accommodate to an extent. Unfortunately, all those things don't have a very clear answer, because it's a question of social change is not a question of black and white. It's a process. So if all your citizens try to get another, this is the case in Israel now, all the upper class tries to get a foreign citizenship because people are very frightened from what will happen here. We will pay a price for that.
Mm.
Because lots of people start to say, okay, if it doesn't work here, then I go. Then they're less active, they're less politically engaged, they're less worried about the future because there is an option. So it's a question of balance. Some people with dual citizenship has never, burdened a system. When the whole elite is trying to look out, and it happens in many countries in East Europe, that the elites are going out, taking dual citizenship, never coming back, leaving the really worse off behind, that becomes a problem, which is the same thing with immigrants. A certain amount of immigrants are welcome and create really welcome diversity. A certain amount of immigrants from certain point, and it's very hard to know how many, can create a much greater challenge. So I'm always reluctant to say yes or no. I'm more reluctant to say, and I'm more inclined to say that we should sort of really learn the situation and see how it affects the social structure.
Okay. Thank you for that. There's a question now from Samuel Miller. He says, many people have clear ideas about when nationalism becomes extreme. For example, claims of racial superiority, for example. But people seem to have less of a clear grasp on when liberalism or progressivism goes too far. What are your thoughts on liberalism's extremes?
Well, neoliberalism,
Well,
when the market controls everything and the state is, is inclined to waive its obligation to its citizens, and personal freedoms come before the common good. For me, that leads to as many miseries and inequalities and desperate consequences as some of nationalism. People never slaughter people in the name of market liberalism, but capitalism in the way of, in the time of colonialism, did do some great harm. I always, when I teach Mill on Liberty, for all of you who remember, it's page 35 in Hebrew. I don't know what it is in the English version, but there is this really horrific thing that he writes. Okay, this is only for the advanced nations, because those primitive nations needs our guidance, and therefore, it's okay for us to conquer them in order to educate them. that was a
Right.
thought based on liberal paternalism. That was terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me press it a bit. I think the questioner, when he mentions liberalism slash progressivism, has in mind not neoliberalism, but what would amount to the left wing of the Democratic Party today, and maybe bears upon your sense or predictions about where Joe Biden is likely to go. I think that those are the extremes of liberalism that the questioner has in mind. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, not being an expert, I think Joe Biden tries to stay really in the middle. He's not inclined to go to the extremes. And that I think it's a smart move on his part, partly in order to unite the people and partly in order to balance out the kind of things that he's doing. He seems to be, again, as much as you can say in such a short period of time, quite sort of restrained and
Yeah,
I'm not going all the way, but I'm not ignoring his claims. Maybe the one thing he might be a little bit more sort of determined about would be the green policy, but that's not too bad. Uh, um, but the big challenges are ahead.
yeah,
Immigration, symbolism, things that people usually in the liberal progressive camp seem to say, oh, there's no problem.
right.
But I think Mexico will become his first challenge. My guess, and it's only a guess, and it's sort of built a little bit on what I see now as an emerging of convergence of ideas that are actually quite common in the Netherlands, in the Scandinavian countries, even in New Zealand and other countries, is some sort of an overlap between green environmental policies, welfare policies, because there's a lot of welfare needed now, and unlike 2008, it's not going to go to the banks, it's going to go to the people and workplaces and so on. And a certain amount of nationalism that has to do with restricting, not preventing, but restricting immigration, and maybe dealing better with the people who are, certainly dealing better with the people who are already there, and maybe giving more opportunities to the people who come in, so they won't be a burden. Because I don't know, 500 immigrants in America are not an issue. 500 immigrants in a neighborhood, as we say, could change the life of another 5,000 people.
Yeah,
And that's the responsibility of the state, not to be generous on the expense of the weak members of society.
well said. I think, not to draw it out any further, but I think the what the question raises, and you kind of direct it toward, is how much the progressives are going to let Joe Biden be Joe Biden, and how reasonable they're going to be. And I think the questioner, if not the questioner, I have a concern or a fear. You don't have to answer this. That the progressives aren't going to be very moderate in their positions. But we will see. We will see. Um, um,
Yeah.
Here, I have got a question from a Cuban American friend, Arturo Lopez Levy. Um, he says, one way to read your book is to consider it a clarion call for human rights and democracy promotion, and to look again at the contributions of nationalism to these causes. Your book looks at times as a case for compromise within the tensions between liberalism and nationalism. Can you share some cases of some successful compromises between these two ideas? How do they compare to cases of communitarianism in Asia, such as Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore?
So Peter and Yulia, I'm going to intervene to be rude, forgive me. I would love to reply, and I'm sorry to say we have 3.5 minutes left. So sorry about that, and there you go.
Okay. Yuli, do you want to take 3.5 minutes to try to answer
Yeah,
that?
I'll
Or
do it very, I'll do it very quickly. First of all, I know very little about Asia, so I'm reluctant to answer on that. But I think the Nordic states are a very good, and also New Zealand and in some cases Australia are good examples of liberal nationalism. They're very, very clear about their identity. They're very clear about that this identity is highly connected to the welfarism, and that welfarism and identity are highly connected to a certain continuity of the political order, and therefore they want to create states that are small, stable, and to some extent, or to close. It's not a come in, come out sort of kind of policy, but it's we admit people who are in real need, but we first of all care for our citizens, which I think is the basic social contract democracy has created. So I'm sorry I can't speak about Singapore, but in the West, I think it has worked well in many countries that are exemplary in my mind.
Okay. Well, you may not have had much to say about Singapore, but you've had a lot to say about many other interesting questions and in many different contexts. So we appreciate your broad and thoughtful perspective. I can report that one of our listeners, Daniel Siligson, has reported that he's bought your book. So that's always a nice thing for an author to hear. So with that, we'll thank you, Yuli, and thanks to Jeff and his colleagues for making this possible. And thanks to all of you for attending and your questions.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Julie. Great conversation.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.